let's talk. Mike Daisey.
Oh my gosh, Mike Daisey.
I love him.
I do too.
I read your review of the new Mike Daisey show that we both saw last night, his brand new monologue that premiered here at Spoleto, and I wanted to talk to you about it.
Absolutely.
Your review was really interesting. I got the impression you didn't like the show.
Why?
Your review came across as pretty negative. You said it didn't really emotionally connect with you. You called it rudimentary. You know, it seemed like you had more criticisms of it than good things to say about it.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think it was a frustrating situation to walk into because you have on your schedule a show, Teching in India, that people are paying $32 for a ticket for. They're expecting that to be the show. Some people have India on their mind. They're wanting to walk into that show. And despite the fact that Spoleto Festival did everything they could to get the word out that the show had changed, there are still people in that audience who think they've paid to see a show they're not going to get to see. So you're walking in, I think, with this expectation of something that is completely changed. And I didn't have that expectation. I knew I was on assignment. I knew what I was walking into. But I have to feel a little bit for the audience around me who doesn't understand what they're seeing. And he introduces it and he explains and he says, I hope you know what you're walking into. And that's fine and that's great. But then he launches into a monologue about a scandal that he never talks about.
He's obviously referring to the This American Life controversy, but you're right, he never sets that context for people that might not be up to date and know about it.
Right, and I've been following it from day one. I mean, I was a fan of Mike Daisey before the scandal, and I stuck with him through it. You know, I have every reason to like the show last night, and I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it. I found parts of it incredibly moving and poetic, and I think it took a lot of courage to present that work to an audience. I just think that he shorted his audience, especially those people who aren't his biggest fans and walked in there not knowing what they were going to see.
In your review, you implied that you thought he should have focused more on the scandal and more on that controversy and that conversation. I thought he actually focused on it quite a lot.
But he never said what it was. My point is that you can't talk about something metaphorically and beautifully and poetically if you don't ever get to the heart of what was he thinking in those moments. Why was he broken?
I don't necessarily think that was quite as necessary. The thing is, I thought the first half in particular was very compelling.
Yes,
because he's talking about the scandal, and he's made himself so vulnerable. And so humble, talking about, you know, and he got choked up a few times.
Yes, he did.
You know, thinking back to that period over the past couple months, and I was very emotionally affected by some of those scenes.
I was too. I was too.
And as the monologue basically follows him on this trip as he's sort of recreating the path of the Orient Express. And for that first half, it seemed like the stories he was telling about these places he visited were in one way or another related to that idea of narrative and related to that idea of, well, we construct our own stories all the time. When we travel, when we're on Facebook and social media, we're always the characters in our own story, and we're always determining what our narrative will be.
Right, and like in Vienna, there was that brilliant moment, I thought I didn't have room, space, or time to touch on it in my review, but there's this moment in Vienna where he's at this hotel that's this part of the history, and he's talking about layering narrative and how that's how we build histories, both as a society and as a person, and how he became a part of that history. And I think, you know, when you know what happened and you know all of these things that he was party to, you totally understand why that was important to him, and it's incredibly moving. It was brilliant. But half the audience doesn't know.
You know, I was fully on board for, I'd say, at least the first hour and a half. And I was really into it. You know, I thought, even though this is a work in progress, and you can tell he's still stumbling over his words a few times. He's finding the right phrase, and but aside from that, I thought it was all really great. And then I'd say probably at about the hour and 40-minute mark, I was kind of thinking, okay, I can sense a common thread here. I can sense an emotional hook as well with the whole, there's this, a subplot involving his wife and so I was engaged on an intellectual and an emotional level, and I thought, all right, let's just bring this to fruition. Let's just bring it all together and give some closing thoughts or questions about these themes that you want to leave the audience with.
Yeah.
And it kept going, and a lot of the stories in the second half of the piece, unfortunately, I thought weren't quite as closely related to those themes.
Well, and it honestly felt a little bit, and this is, I think, one of the things that I touched on a little bit is I started to think, why aren't you just saying what you want to say? You want to talk about how this trip affected you, and he keeps going on these tangents about, and I think there was one I think it was in Budapest, the Terror Museum, that I especially didn't fully know what he was saying.
And a lot of the stories are interesting, but it's kind of like they don't feel like they were part of this narrative that he had been on.
Yeah.
And with these themes that he wanted to explore. It feels like they should be in a different show.
Yeah. And they would be brilliant. I mean, he's so smart, and he's such a good writer. And he's got so many ideas in his head. I would love to be in his head and see the world the way he sees it. But sometimes he was like on tangents, and I didn't follow.
And I understand this is a work in progress.
Right. Yes.
And I think the show's going to evolve and get a lot tighter.
I think it's going to be. It's going to be brilliant.
That first half, especially, was so strong. I thought once he tightens this up, he'll be fine. This is going to save his reputation. It'll save his career.
Yeah.
He's totally going to recover from the controversy if he is this vulnerable, and if he's this honest, and if he's raising these interesting themes and these ideas in the show. The problem is he needs to cut about 40 minutes.
Yeah. And I don't think he kind of. I kind of got the impression there was a moment where he looked up and he saw when people were leaving.
Right.
It's like about 2 hours in, people were like, "I'm checking out." And I think he knows.
Yeah, the whole show was about 2.5 hours, and it needs to be about an hour 45.
Yeah. I mean, he can pull off the 2-hour monologue in a way not many performers can, but I agree. An hour 45 minutes is about standard.
So, I think if he said he wants to go, he's going through pretty much all of the stops he made on the trip. I think he needs to cut out a few of them.
And he even skips one, didn't he say?
He skipped Bucharest.
Yeah.
And
skip another
he
one,
needs to skip a couple more and just tighten it up and save some of those stories that aren't quite as related to these larger ideas and to these intellectual and emotional threads. Save them for another show.
Yeah. And I almost feel like, and I'm not a fan of people capitalizing on things like this, but I almost I would really like to read this as a memoir. Like, I think, and he's such a good writer.
Right.
I would really appreciate a book about these, not 2.5 hours of one person talking to me. And I was putting it into context. Right. At this festival, we have the 35-minute opera, and Kepler's probably the same length as the show we saw last night. I mean, the opera here. So it felt a little bit like you're monopolizing my time.
Right. I think we both agree on the whole as to what worked and what didn't. I feel like probably in your review you came off as overall more negative.
Right.
While maybe I'm just more optimistic, and I'm just kind of like, all right, Mike Daisey, that was great for a first try.
Yeah.
Let's cut it down, let's tighten it up, and this has potential to be something really special.
And I think the negativity that you read, and I think is present in my review. And I mean, in some ways, I think the show shouldn't be reviewed yet. It should be workshopped.
Right.
But unfortunately, he presented it to an audience that had all paid for tickets to a show. So you have to take that into consideration when you're writing about it.
Right.
Especially because this festival is world renowned, and what a great experience that we got to see this premiere of this work, and that we're going to get to follow it on its journey.
Especially when you compare it to, having just seen his Steve Jobs show a few nights before.
Oh, yeah.
Seeing this is what the fully polished show that he's been doing for 2 years looks like, where he knows exactly how to inflect his voice when, exactly what gestures to make at certain points. That show is so tight. And having seen the opposite of that, this is the first one, was really great. I thought.
I have a question for you, because I wanted to explore this more in my review, but again, I ended up with half an hour to write it and compress it all. in the Steve Jobs show, he has an antagonist. I mean, he has Steve Jobs
Sure.
as this sort of juxtaposition with the character of himself going over and, going to China and exploring all of these problems. Do you think that last night's show lacked a second fully fledged character? I mean, he had a
I
slide.
don't think so.
Okay.
I think the show the monologue he performed last night will be fine as long as he realizes he's his own antagonist.
Right, exactly.
For this show.
Yes.
And it's about his brokenness and his struggle of dealing with this and dealing with these concepts and these ideas and how he's bouncing back from that. This is his time in the wilderness, basically. And once he if he can figure out a way to just wrap that up and bring those ideas together at the end, I think it's going to be a great show.
Yeah.
At the end of its
Yeah.
run.
What I especially appreciated, I think he almost was there, I think, with himself, the sort of battle between himself, because you had that moment in Brooklyn where he was describing that he went out into his backyard naked and looked up at the full moon.
Yes.
And you have this beautiful, you can picture it, you can picture that moment. And then you have at the end a sort of parallel, but he's changed, he's different, he's grateful.
Right.
And he's looking out, and he's in Istanbul, and he's looking out at the hang glider that he's picturing as himself, and he has that moment with his wife, and I think it's beautiful.
It is.
And I really appreciate all of the real, very real and genuine.
I felt like that moment has potential to be even stronger if he can bring, again, as mentioned, those themes about storytelling and truth together with that emotional moment. That'll be magnificent, I think. So, Mike Daisey, if you're listening, great job.
We did enjoy it.
We did enjoy it. Tighten it up, and I think you're onto something here. This could be something really great.
But what do we know?
What do we know? We're just critics.
We're just critics.
Yeah.